The year was 1854, and Rio de Janeiro was less a city and more a living, breathing fever. The sun did not merely shine, it interrogated the earth, pressing down with a weight that turned the air into a shimmering liquid haze. Along the steep, winding streets, the cobblestones became furnaces, radiating a dry heat that danced above the ground in ghostly ripples. While the harbour bustled with the indifferent coming and going of merchant ships, vessels that carried the wealth of empires and the misery of the displaced, the interior of the grand colonial mansions offered a deceptive stillness. Behind thick stone walls and heavy timber shutters, the wealthy sought refuge, but for those whose lives were defined by the labour of their hands, there was no such sanctuary. The kitchens remained roaring infernos of wood smoke and steam, the laundry rooms sweltered with the heavy humidity of boiling water, and the sun-baked courtyards offered only the harsh, unyielding light of a sky that seemed to watch with cold, divine apathy. Perched atop a hill with a commanding view of the glistening Atlantic was the residence of Donna Mariana Vasconos. The house was not merely a home, it was an altar to her own vanity, a monument constructed from the spoils of her late husband's fortune. Mariana was a woman who moved through life with the absolute certainty that the world was an instrument intended for her play. Her rooms were filled with the silent evidence of excess: silk drapes harvested from the Orient, intricate furniture shipped from the workshops of Portugal, and crystal chandeliers that fractured the afternoon light into thousands of mocking shards of gold. Every surface gleamed, not by magic, but through the exhaustive, unceasing labor of those she considered invisible. To Mariana, the people who polished her silver and swept her floors were no different from the chairs they dusted, functional, replaceable, and entirely devoid of an interior life. In her mind, her comfort was the natural order of the universe, and any disruption to that comfort was a personal affront against the divine. Among the invisible hands that maintained this facade was Benedita. At 19, the harsh geography of a life spent in bondage had already mapped itself across her face, carving lines of weary wisdom into a countenance that should have still been soft with youth. Benedita had been born on a coffee plantation in the Paraíba Valley, a place where the air was thick with the scent of red earth and the sound of the overseer's whistle. Her mother had perished in the heat of a harvest, and her father had been sold into the distant horizon before she was old enough to hold his memory steady in her mind. By the age of 14, she had been brought to the capital and purchased by Mariana, a transaction that moved her from the wide, brutal openness of the fields to the narrow, suffocating refinement of the city. For 5 years, Benedita had lived within Mariana's walls, learning the intricate, silent choreography of survival. She had mastered the art of moving like a shadow, of anticipating needs before they were voiced, and of shrinking her spirit until it was small enough to fit into the cramped corners of the servants' quarters. The household was a rigid pyramid of human value, and Benedita occupied its most precarious depths. At the summit sat Mariana, the undisputed sovereign. Below her were the free servants, impoverished workers who traded their freedom for a pittance, their choices limited by a society that offered them little more than the chance to serve. At the very base were the enslaved, Benedita, an elderly gardener named Tomas, and a 12-year-old girl named Rosa. Tomas was a man of quiet, weathered dignity, who moved among the roses as if he were whispering secrets to the soil, his body a testament to decades of unrequited toil. Rosa, barely a woman, worked in the kitchen with a frantic, desperate energy, her eyes constantly darting toward the doorway in anticipation of a blow. They were property, legally bound and socially erased, their bodies and hours owned by a woman who spent her days contemplating the drape of a new silk gown. In this house, the value of a human soul was measured entirely by its utility to Mariana's whims. Mariana's expectations were not merely high, they were mathematical in their precision. Breakfast was a ritual that demanded perfection. The bread must be warm, the fruit sliced into identical crescents, and the silver polished until it could serve as a mirror for her morning vanity. The schedule was absolute, a clockwork of servitude that allowed for no human frailty. Any deviation, a minute's lateness, a smudge on a porcelain cup, a hint of fatigue in a servant's posture, was treated as a deliberate act of insurrection. Mariana found a dark satisfaction in identifying these flaws. It was her way of reminding the household that their place in the world was beneath her feet, a hierarchy she believed was ordained by both law and heaven. For Benedita, the day did not begin with the sun, but with the heavy pressure of these expectations, a weight that settled on her chest the moment she opened her eyes in the pre-dawn darkness. On a particular morning in late January, the humidity had already reached a suffocating peak before the first light hit the harbor. Benedita entered the kitchen to find the air already thick with the heat of the cooking fires. Every movement felt like wading through deep water. Sweat gathered on her brow as she moved through the mechanical routine of lighting the stove and arranging the tray for Mariana's private dining room. Beside her, young Rosa worked in a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. They had learned long ago that conversation was a luxury they could not afford. In Mariana's house, silence was the only acceptable soundtrack to labor. However, that morning, Benedita's body was in open rebellion. A sharp, rhythmic cramping in her abdomen signaled the start of her monthly cycle, a natural process that the world of 1854 offered no accommodation for. There was no rest, no medicine, and no mercy. The work had to be done, regardless of the blood, the pain, or the exhaustion that threatened to pull her to her knees. As she ascended the narrow back stairs, balancing the heavy silver tray with practiced grace, Benedita felt the familiar surge of resentment that she usually kept buried in the deepest part of her soul. The hallway was lined with the portraits of Mariana's ancestors, stern, powdered men and women who watched her passage with the same cold indifference as their living descendant. To them, she was a ghost in her own life, a vessel for labor, and nothing more. Mariana was already seated at the table, draped in a gown of pale yellow silk that seemed to mock the sweat-stained cotton of Benedita's dress. She did not look up with a greeting. She looked up with a stopwatch in her mind. "You are 3 minutes late," she said, her voice like the snap of a cold breeze in the sweltering room. "I do not pay for convenience, Benedita. I pay for competence." In that moment, as the pain in her stomach sharpened and the heat of the room pressed in, Benedita felt the first hairline fracture in her mask of submission. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of lavender water and the metallic tang of the silver service, a sensory contrast to the humid, wood-smoke atmosphere of the kitchen Benedita had just escaped. As she moved to set the table, the sharp, rhythmic throbbing in her abdomen made the world tilt slightly. She focused on the mechanical precision of her hands, placing the porcelain cups in their designated orbits, ensuring the handles faced the exact angle Mariana preferred. Every movement was a calculation, a desperate attempt to maintain the illusion of a perfect machine. However, the body is not a machine, and under the pressure of intense physical pain and the suffocating heat of a Rio summer, even the most disciplined focus can falter. As she reached for the plate of sliced mango, a particularly sharp cramp seized her, causing her fingers to twitch involuntarily. The plate tilted, and a single glistening orange slice slid across the fine linen, leaving a vivid, sticky trail of juice on the pristine white tablecloth. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the harbor. Benedita froze, her eyes locked on the stain, which looked like a wound on the fabric. She could feel Mariana's gaze shifting from the window to the table, a transition that felt like the gathering of a storm. Mariana did not shout. She stood slowly, her yellow silk gown rustling with a sound like dry leaves. She approached the table with a predatory grace, her eyes narrowed into slits of cold, calculating fury. "Do you have any concept of what you have done?" she asked, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that carried more menace than a scream. "This linen was brought from Lisbon. It is older than you, and infinitely more valuable. You treat my home with the same careless filth you brought from the fields, as if your very presence isn't already a stain upon this house." Mariana's hand shot out, her fingers locking around Benedita's wrist with a strength born of pure, distilled entitlement. She pulled Benedita forward, forcing her to look at the ruined tablecloth. "You exist only within the margins of my grace," Mariana hissed, her face inches from Benedita's. "You are not a person who makes mistakes. You are an object that has failed its function. If a chair breaks, I replace it. If a glass shatters, I sweep it away. Do not think for a moment that your life is any different. You own nothing, not your clothes, not your labor, and certainly not your insolent fatigue." She reached for the silver coffee pot, which was still radiating a fierce heat from the stove. With a calm, terrifying deliberation, she tilted the spout. Benedita's eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat, but Mariana's grip was an iron shackle. The steaming liquid hit Benedita's hand in a searing dark stream, a focused burst of agony that made the world turn white. The pain was a living thing, a jagged blade of heat that carved through the skin of Benedita's hand. She wanted to scream, to pull away, to strike back, but 5 years of enforced submission held her vocal cords in a tight grip. She only managed a jagged, choked gasp as the coffee soaked into her skin and the linen below. Mariana watched the red welts begin to rise with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. "This is a reminder," Mariana said, finally releasing her grip and returning the pot to its tray as if nothing of significance had occurred. "You will learn the value of my property through the cost to your own flesh. Now, remove this filth and tell Rosa to bring fresh linens. My breakfast is cold, and your incompetence has already wasted enough of my morning." Benedita stumbled back, cradling her hand against her chest, the skin already bubbling into angry, translucent blisters. In the kitchen, the atmosphere shattered the moment Benedita crossed the threshold. Rosa gasped, her small hands flying to her mouth, while Thomas dropped the bundle of wood he was carrying, the heavy thud echoing against the stone floor. He moved toward her, his weathered face a mask of grief and resignation. He did not ask what had happened. The steam rising from the red skin told the story with brutal clarity. He gently guided her toward the stone basin, pumping cool water over the burn. The relief was only superficial, a thin layer of cold over a core of pulsing fire. "I hate her," Benedita whispered, the words finally breaking through the wall of her silence, sharp and jagged as broken glass. "I hate her with every breath I have left." Thomas looked at her, his eyes reflecting a lifetime of similar moments. "Nothing lasts forever, child," he said softly. "The sun sets even on the longest day. We endure because we must, but the seasons always turn." The weeks following the injury were a blur of suppressed agony and relentless labor. There was no medicine for a slave's burn, only scraps of old cloth and the occasional application of grease from the kitchen. Benedita worked with one hand, her movements awkward and slow, which only served to invite more of Mariana's sharp-tongued rebukes. The mistress viewed the bandage as a visual offense, an unsightly blemish on the aesthetic of her household, and ordered Benedita to keep the hand hidden whenever possible. The physical wound eventually closed, leaving behind a thick, corded scar of pink tissue that stretched across her palm, a permanent map of Mariana's cruelty. But beneath the scar, something else was hardening. The anger that had once been a chaotic, flickering flame was cooling into a solid, heavy weight. Benedita was no longer just surviving. She was observing, her mind beginning to trace the outlines of a world where she was no longer an object. The shift in the household's energy became palpable in mid-February when Mariana announced her intention to host a grand luncheon for the city's social elite. The news was a declaration of war against the servants' already depleted strength. For Mariana, it was an opportunity to assert her status in a society that valued appearance above all else. For Benedita, Rosa and Thomas, it was a sentence of endless nights and brutal days. The house was to be dismantled and cleaned with a level of intensity that bordered on the obsessive. Every piece of silver, every inch of lace, and every corner of the rose garden was to be subjected to Mariana's uncompromising scrutiny. As the preparations began, the heat of Rio intensified, turning the mansion into a pressure cooker where the lines between order and collapse began to blur. Benedita watched Rosa's trembling hands as the girl scrubbed the floors, and she knew that the upcoming event would be the catalyst for a change none of them could yet name. The preparations for the luncheon demanded a level of perfection that seemed designed to break the human spirit. Mariana walked through the rooms like a general, her silk fan clicking open and shut with a rhythmic aggression that signaled her mounting anxiety. She demanded the finest French china be brought from the high storage, the heavy lace tablecloths from Portugal be starched until they were stiff as paper, and the silver polished until it hurt the eyes to look at it. Benedita and Rosa worked until their fingers were raw, their bodies moving through the house like specters in the flickering light of tallow candles, long after the city had gone to sleep. During one of these midnight shifts, Rosa stumbled, a stack of porcelain plates wobbling dangerously in her arms. Benedita caught her just in time, and for a brief moment, they stood together in the dark, two exhausted souls tethered to a machine that did not care if they broke. The day before the event, the final disaster struck in the form of a shattered platter. It was a piece of hand-painted porcelain from Sèvres, decorated with delicate blue flowers, Mariana's favorite. Rosa had been carrying it to the dining room when her foot caught on a loose floorboard. The sound of the platter hitting the stone floor was a sharp, final report that seemed to echo through the very foundations of the house. Mariana appeared almost instantly, her face a mask of cold, white rage. She did not scream. She made Rosa kneel on the jagged shards of the porcelain while she lectured her on the inherent worthlessness of her kind. Benedita watched from the shadows of the hallway, her hand clenching into a fist, the scar on her palm pulsing with a sympathetic heat. She watched the blood seep through Rosa's thin dress and onto the floor, and in that moment, the last thread of her compliance snapped. The morning of the luncheon arrived with a sky so blue it looked painted, a vibrant backdrop to the chaos unfolding within the Vasconcelos mansion. By 10 o'clock, the heat was already a physical presence, a thick, invisible hand pressing against the lungs. Benedita and Rosa moved through the rooms like clockwork ghosts, finishing the final arrangements under Mariana's sharp, hawk-like supervision. The table was a masterpiece of colonial opulence, draped in the Portuguese lace that had cost Rosa her dignity and the skin on her knees. Every piece of silver caught the filtered sunlight, reflecting a blinding, artificial brilliance that masked the hours of scrubbing and the tears shed in the dark. The scent of the house was a confusing mix of heavy perfumes, beeswax, and the savory, spiced aromas wafting from the kitchen, where a dozen dishes were reaching their peak. It was a sensory assault designed to overwhelm and impress, a performance of wealth that relied entirely on the absolute erasure of the performer's own humanity. When the first carriages began to rattle up the cobblestone drive at noon, the transition from labor to service was instantaneous. The guests, women of high status, wrapped in layers of lace and silk that seemed defiant of the tropical heat, spilled into the parlor with a cacophony of bright, artificial laughter. Among them was Donna Augusta, a woman whose reputation for strictness rivaled Mariana's own. As Benedita moved among them with a tray of chilled wine, she was struck by the peculiar nature of their gaze. They did not look at her as a woman, or even as a servant. They looked through her, as if she were a transparent part of the architecture. Their conversations were a whirlwind of social currency, who had been seen at the opera, the rising cost of imported coffee, and the perpetual problem of managing their households. To these women, the people who poured their wine and cleaned their linens were not human beings with histories or hearts, but unruly livestock that required constant, firm calibration. The luncheon proceeded through 3 agonizing hours of gossip and consumption. Benedita stood in the corner of the dining room, her burned hand hidden in the folds of her apron, watching the rhythmic dance of silverware against fine china. The conversation eventually turned, as it often did in these circles, to the logistics of discipline. Donna Augusta, leaning back as she gestured with a half-full glass of imported port, spoke with a casual clinicality that made Benedita's blood run cold. She described how she had recently corrected an enslaved girl for a minor infraction, speaking of the punishment not as an act of anger, but as a necessary maintenance of order. "The trouble with these creatures," Augusta said, her voice smooth and untroubled, "is that they possess a persistent delusion of personhood. If you allow them even a moment of leniency, they begin to imagine their lives have a value beyond their utility. One must be consistent, Mariana. The lash is not for the body, it is for the soul, to remind it of its proper place in the cosmic hierarchy." The other women murmured their agreement, sharing similar anecdotes of necessary cruelty as if they were discussing the weather or the quality of a seamstress's work. It was in this moment, surrounded by the bright chatter of the elite, that Benedita felt the final, fundamental shift in her consciousness. She realized that Mariana was not an anomaly. She was a symptom. The cruelty she had endured was not a personal failure of her mistress, but the very foundation upon which this entire world was built. These women were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were wives, mothers, and friends who believed their own morality was perfectly intact while they discussed the systematic dehumanization of others over poached fish and wine. The realization was more terrifying than any physical blow. If the evil was structural, then no amount of silence or perfect service would ever earn her safety. The system was designed to consume her, and the only way to save her soul was to step outside the machine entirely. When the final guest had departed and the last carriage had vanished into the humid afternoon, Mariana surveyed the dining room with a look of triumphant exhaustion. "Clean it," she commanded, not even looking at Benedita as she turned toward the stairs. "I want every glass washed, every crumb vanished, and the silver put away before the sun sets. And do it quietly. I have a headache." The wreckage of the luncheon was staggering. Half-eaten delicacies, stained linens, and a mountain of fragile porcelain that required delicate handling. Benedita and Rosa worked in a state of near catatonia, their bodies operating on muscle memory while their minds retreated to a safe, internal distance. It took hours of back-breaking labor to restore the room to its sterile perfection. By the time they finished, the shadows had stretched across the harbor, and the first stars were beginning to flicker, indifferent witnesses to the exhaustion that threatened to collapse Benedita's lungs. That night, lying on her thin mattress as the city outside hummed with the sounds of the nocturnal world, Benedita did not pray for patience. She began to calculate. She thought about the patterns of the house, the hours when the guards at the nearby customs house changed their shift, the narrow alleyways that led toward the docks, and the whispered rumors Tomas had shared about the free black communities in the north. She realized that her survival depended on her ability to become as cold and observant as Mariana herself. She would need resources, coins, a disguise, a weapon. Most importantly, she would need to wait for the exact moment when Mariana's vanity eclipsed her vigilance. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was no longer paralyzing. It was a fuel. As she stared at the dark ceiling, the corded scar on her hand felt like a compass, pointing her away from the hill and toward the uncertain, dangerous promise of the horizon. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in strategic deception. Benedita became the perfect servant, her movements more fluid and her silences more profound than ever before. She anticipated Mariana's every whim with a precision that bordered on the supernatural, earning a rare, suspicious sort of approval from her mistress. Beneath this veneer of total submission, however, Benedita was a scavenger. She squirreled away scraps of information from overheard conversations between Mariana and her business manager, learning about the family's mounting debts and the vulnerabilities in their financial holdings. She observed the layout of the harbor from the upstairs windows, memorizing the silhouettes of the merchant ships and the schedules of the smaller skiffs that ferried goods to the larger vessels. Every day was a gamble, a performance where the stakes were her life, but the internal clarity she had gained at the luncheon provided a steady, unyielding strength that allowed her to endure the daily degradations with a new, quiet power. By September of 1855, the shimmering facade of the Vasconos estate had begun to crack under the weight of mounting debts and the unrelenting humidity of a Rio summer that refused to yield. The air in the mansion was no longer merely warm, it was thick with the scent of stagnation and the metallic tang of desperation. Donna Mariana, once a woman of unshakable poise, had become a creature of volatile moods and sharp edges. Her financial manager was now a frequent, unwelcome visitor, his presence always followed by the mistress's redirected fury toward those she still managed to own. For Benedita, this shift meant that the casual cruelties of the past were being replaced by a more desperate form of malice. The household felt like a glass ornament that had been dropped and was held together only by the sheer force of Mariana's denial. Every day was a gauntlet of unpredictable triggers, where a misplaced word or a moment of visible exhaustion could result in a punishment that felt increasingly like an attempt to erase the very existence of those who served. The arrival of a single bolt of deep blue silk in mid-September served as the catalyst for the ultimate rupture. It was a fabric of extraordinary quality, shimmering like the deep Atlantic under a midnight moon, intended for a gown that Mariana hoped would restore her social standing at the upcoming spring ball. As Benedita held the heavy fabric for inspection, the sun caught the intricate weave, casting a blue glow against her dark, scarred palms. Mariana watched her with a cold, analytical gaze, her fan snapping shut with a sound like a pistol shot. "Do you have any idea what that cost, girl?" Mariana asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "That silk was brought across the ocean on a ship that carried the fortunes of men far greater than any you will ever know. It cost considerably more than you are worth on the open market today. Remember that. If you so much as leave a smudge of oil or a drop of sweat on those threads, I will ensure you spend the rest of your days in a place where silk is a myth and the sun never sets on your labor." The weight of that comparison, the bolt of fabric valued higher than the human soul holding it, lodged in Benedita's heart like a shard of ice. It was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal accounting of her life's worth in the eyes of the law and the woman standing before her. 2 days later, the tension reached its breaking point during a jewelry cleaning session in Mariana's private chambers. The room was a sanctuary of excess, filled with the scent of imported rosewater and the suffocating stillness of closed shutters. Mariana sat at her vanity, directing Benedita through the meticulous cleaning of her emerald collection. "This necklace could buy 10 of you," Mariana remarked casually, dangling a strand of vibrant green stones that seemed to pulse with a light of their own. 15, perhaps, if the buyers were in a generous mood. It is fascinating, isn't it? How something pulled from the dirt can hold so much more value than a creature that can speak and bleed. The air in the room seemed to vanish as Mariana's words hung in the stillness. Benedita worked in silence, her fingers moving with a mechanical grace that masked the roaring fire in her chest. As she reached for a diamond bracelet, Mariana's irritation flared at a perceived hesitation. She snatched the jewelry back with such sudden, violent force that the sharp metal clasp tore a jagged line across Benedita's palm, right through the center of her old burn scar. A thin, bright line of blood welled up instantly, staining the white velvet of the cleaning cloth. "Don't you dare bleed on my things!" Mariana shrieked, her concern entirely focused on the diamonds. "Get out of my sight and clean yourself. You are a clumsy, worthless burden, and I should have sent you to the plantations years ago." Benedita did not move. She stood her ground, the blood dripping onto the floor, and for the first time in 5 years, she looked directly into Mariana's eyes, her gaze level and unyielding. "I am a person," Benedita said, her voice a calm, steady resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the room. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that swallowed Mariana's rage and replaced it with a flickering, primitive fear. The mistress stumbled back, her hand flying to her throat as if the words were a physical blow. The declaration was an act of war, a refusal to participate in the shared delusion of her own non-existence. Mariana's face contorted into a mask of pure, distilled hatred, her voice trembling as she finally managed to speak. "You will pay for that insolence with your skin," she hissed. "I will have you broken until you forget how to speak entirely. Go to your room and wait. The overseer will be here by sunset to remind you exactly what you are." Benedita turned and walked out, her heart hammering a rhythm of terrifying liberation. The mask had been cast aside, and there was no going back. In the small, stifling room she shared with Rosa, Benedita began to gather the few items she had spent months secreting away. The blue silk, the emeralds, the fine china, all of it felt like ash compared to the heavy kitchen knife she tucked into her bodice and the few copper coins hidden in the hem of her dress. Rosa watched from the corner, her eyes wide with a terror that made her look even younger than her 12 years. "You have to go," Rosa whispered, her voice shaking. "She means it, Benedita. She's going to kill you." Benedita grabbed the girl's hands, feeling the calluses and the trembling. "I am going," Benedita said, "and you must stay silent. Tell her you saw nothing. Tell her I vanished like smoke. Do not let her see your fear, Rosa. That is how she feeds." The guilt of leaving the child behind was a physical ache, a weight that threatened to pull Benedita back into the safety of submission, but she knew that if she stayed, they would both be lost. The escape was a blur of adrenaline and sensory overload. She chose the laundry room window, a narrow aperture that looked out onto a trash-strewn alleyway. The wood of the frame was rough, catching on her skin as she wriggled through, a final physical struggle against the house that had held her captive for 5 years. She landed hard on the cobblestones below, the impact vibrating through her teeth, and for a moment she simply lay there, breathing in the scent of damp earth and rotting fruit. Above her, the mansion loomed like a dark, silent monolith, its windows reflecting the dying light of the sun. She stood up, her legs feeling like water, and began to run. She did not look back. She navigated the labyrinthine backstreets of Rio, moving toward the docks where the city's shadows were deepest, and the law was a flexible, coin-operated suggestion. Every footstep behind her sounded like pursuit. Every shadow looked like a patrol. By the time she reached the waterfront, the moon had risen, casting a silver path across the harbor that looked like a bridge to another world. The docks were a cacophony of creaking timber, lapping water, and the rough shouts of sailors. She found the ship the priest had described, a weather-beaten merchant vessel that looked as exhausted as she felt. Her contact, a man with skin the color of polished obsidian and eyes that had seen the far side of the horizon, was waiting in the lee of a stack of cargo crates. He did not ask for her name. He only looked at the blood on her dress and the set of her jaw. "The tide is turning," he said quietly, gesturing toward a narrow hatch in the hull. "If you can survive the darkness of the hold, the dawn will find us in open water. But once we sail, there is no returning. You will be a ghost to this city, and the hunt will never truly end." Benedita didn't hesitate. She stepped into the darkness of the ship, leaving the fever of 1855 behind, and began the long, silent wait for a morning she wasn't entirely sure she would live to see. The darkness of the ship's hold was absolute, a heavy velvet weight that pressed against Benedita's eyelids until she could no longer tell if they were open or closed. It was a space that felt like both a womb and a tomb, disconnected from the rhythm of the sun and the suffocating expectations of the Vasconcelos mansion. Here, surrounded by the aromatic ghosts of the very commodities that fueled her enslavement, sacks of raw sugar, crates of coffee beans, and bolts of untreated cotton, Benedita existed in a state of suspended animation. The ship, Nossa Senhora da Conceição, groaned and shivered as it fought the Atlantic currents, its timber skeleton singing a low, mournful song of salt and struggle. Every heave of the deck felt like the world itself was trying to vomit her back toward the shore she had fled, yet with every league of open water, the invisible chains of Rio de Janeiro grew thinner. She lay flat against a pile of rough hemp sacks, the corded scar on her hand throbbing in time with the rhythmic slapping of waves against the hull. In this lightless void, she was no longer a servant, a clumsy girl, or a piece of property. She was a heartbeat in the dark, a singular point of will navigating the treacherous gap between the life she had survived and the freedom she had yet to earn. The journey north was a grueling test of stoic endurance. Time became a fluid, unreliable thing, marked only by the infrequent visits of the sailor who had become her silent guardian. He would slip through the hatch during the deepest watches of the night, bringing jars of stale water and scraps of dried meat that tasted of brine and wood smoke. They spoke in whispers, their words barely audible over the roar of the sea. He told her of the Black Atlantic, a hidden network of free sailors and abolitionists who turned merchant vessels into conduits for the displaced. He warned her of the Capitães do Mato, the professional slave hunters who patrolled the ports with dogs and contracts, men whose livelihoods depended on the return of strayed property. This was the informational reality of 1855. The law did not stop at the shoreline. For a fugitive like Benedita, the entire coastline was a serrated edge of danger. Yet, as the sailor spoke of the quilombos, the independent communities of escaped souls carved into the rugged interior of Bahia, Benedita felt a new kind of strength. It was the realization that her resistance was part of a much larger, older tapestry of defiance. She was not a solitary spark. She was part of a slow-burning fire that was beginning to consume the foundations of the empire from within. When the ship finally dropped anchor in the shimmering heat of Salvador, the transition was a sensory explosion. The air here was different, spiced with the scent of palm oil, sea salt, and a vibrant, defiant energy that Rio lacked. Through a gap in the cargo doors, Benedita saw a city of gold and blue, perched precariously on cliffs overlooking the bay. This was the legendary Black Rome, a place where the traditions of the Orishas walked openly in the streets alongside the rigid rituals of the church. Her contact guided her off the ship under the cover of a torrential tropical downpour, the rain washing away the grime of the hold and the last lingering scent of Mariana's lavender water. They moved through the lower city, a labyrinth of narrow alleys and bustling markets where the line between free and enslaved was often a matter of gait and gaze. Benedita felt the weight of 1,000 eyes, but she walked with the level stare she had first practiced in Mariana's parlor. She was a ghost in a city of shadows, moving toward the hills of the interior where the authority of the crown was a distant, toothless memory. The journey was far from over, but the terrain had changed. She was no longer running away from a house, but toward a home. The path to the Quilombo led her deep into the Sertão, a landscape of scrub brush and iron-red earth that seemed to bake under a sun that judged nothing and forgave nothing. After days of trekking through the wilderness, guided by signs left in the placement of stones and the direction of broken branches, she reached the hidden settlement. It was a village of thatch and timber, tucked into a defensive fold of the mountains where the only way in was a path known only to those who had earned the right to walk it. When she first stepped into the central clearing, she was met not with the silence of servitude, but with the cacophony of life, the sound of children laughing, the rhythmic thud of grain being milled, and the voices of people speaking without fear. An elder woman, her face a map of 100 seasons of freedom, approached Benedita and looked at her scarred hand. She didn't see a mark of shame. She saw a badge of survival. In this community, the value of a human being was not calculated in emeralds or silk, but in the strength of their contribution to the collective. Benedita was given a place at the fire, a bowl of stew, and for the first time in her 19 years, the right to say no to the world that had tried to break her. Standing on a ridge overlooking the vast emerald canopy of the Bahian forest, Benedita looked down at her hands. The scars were still there, the burn from the coffee, the tear from the diamond bracelet, but they no longer hurt. They were historical records carved in flesh of a woman who had refused to be a footnote in another person's vanity. She thought of Rosa, still trapped in the cooling embers of the Vasconos household, and she vowed that her freedom would not be a static prize, but a platform for further action. The resilience she had forged in the infernos of Rio was now a tool for building a world where no 12-year-old would ever have to kneel on broken porcelain. As the sun began to set, casting a deep, light sepia glow over the mountains, Benedita realized that Donna Mariana had been right about one thing. Benedita was indeed a stain. She was a stain on the conscience of a cruel society, a permanent, indelible mark that proved the human spirit is an element that cannot be owned, polished, or erased. She was the architect of her own dignity, a survivor of the fever of 1854, and a living testament to the fact that the invisible hands of history are the ones that eventually pull down the walls of every prison. Thank you for experiencing this journey of resilience and the fight for human dignity. If Benedita's story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of the human spirit. Your engagement helps these forgotten narratives reach the light of day. Which part of Benedita's transformation resonated with you the most? Her silent observation in the kitchen or her final declaration of personhood? Let me know in the comments below.